Welcome to The Details with Adam Frower and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics happening in the world. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come and examine details with us. So, Cecil, on this episode of The Details, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about a lot of the global upheaval that is happening, right? It seems like every day there is something new that is challenging, that's difficult, that creates some uncertainty for people. We talked about how in the recent weeks, right, we've had a former prime minister of Japan be assassinated. We had the prime minister of England resign. We have had the president of Sri Lanka also resign and flee his country. So political leaders around the world are, really contributing to and are resulting from this global upheaval. Yeah. But in addition to that, there are things like massive inflation that we've talked about before, global warming, and how that's contributing. We're currently sitting in a heat wave. Yeah. So there's just global upheaval everywhere we look. And we wanted to talk a little bit about some things that people could do to manage and cope with all of this global upheaval. So anything you wanted to say kind of as we start this off?
Well, without inspiring too much cynicism, I would also say, in addition to the global upheaval, there's just this general sense of what's going to happen next, that seems to be hanging over certainly US politics and economics, but I think in Europe and globally as well. I've seen plenty of things in the news about, how does the war in Ukraine long-term affect gas and energy and things like that, but even food, since a lot of materials for fertilizer comes from Russia directly and indirectly. And so that starts to have a lot of impact on food around the world and what that looks like for people who are dependent on that. So in general, I think there's just this kind of hanging, almost dreadful sense of what's next? What's the next thing we're going to have to deal with? What are the consequences of the things we're already dealing with? But in terms of how do we deal with living in a world like this, I think the answer is obviously going to have to be, maybe not obviously, but the answer is going to have to be, instead of looking to the world for your sense of comfort and for your stability, you might have to look inward. You might have to create that sense of comfort for yourself. You might have to find, maybe not necessarily create it for yourself, but come to see that you can feel that being sourced internally.
So that brings up a question, I guess. I think you're right, obviously, about this kind of hanging, looming, like what happens next. But if I don't keep my focus on what's happening externally, and I create, as you say, kind of my own hope, my own expectation, how can I possibly do that if I'm constantly hearing the next thing that's happening or the anticipation of what's to come? It seems like somebody could come back and say, well, I can't control my own sense of purpose or peace or whatever because the world is in disarray.
Well, I would certainly push back on the idea that you can't control your own sense of purpose and that you can't find direction in the midst of disarray. In fact, I think that's when those things are actually most useful to be able to do that. But the answer to the question, what do you do to accomplish that? How do you accomplish that, even given very, negative environmental factors? I think the first thing that comes to mind, and probably the most powerful thing you can do, is establish some sense of what is it that you want anyway? Who knows what is happening in the world and what direction things are going to go in terms of global and political events going on around you. But despite all that, or even in the midst of all that, what is it that you're looking for in the first place?
Yeah, I think you're right. And obviously in solution-focused therapy, one of the things that we start with, despite whatever the problem is, right? Someone could be coming in with depression, or someone could be coming in with another mental health challenge. Somebody could be coming in having experienced a trauma. And regardless of what they're coming in for, we begin by saying, what are you hoping for? What's your desired outcome from this process? And I think separating what is going on from what you want to have happen, that's a really important first step. And we frame it in a way of asking people, what are your best hopes? And that's an awkward saying, right? So. But in some sense, it orients people to, despite what's going on, hope can be present. And it helps people to orient to, there's lots of things I could possibly hope for, but we want to focus on or have a conversation about what is the best one of those hopes. And so I think that's an important component in this realm as well. Even if you're not going to therapy for a particular problem, if you're thinking about, it's hard to manage or cope in an uncertain world. Thinking about, so what do I hope for? And I think there's some important caveats that we need to add to that, right? It's not that we hope that the world will all of a sudden be at peace. It's not that we hope all of a sudden that the financial situation is resolved. I mean, obviously we hope for those things, but those things are outside of most of our control. And so when we talk about what are your best hopes, we really want to ground it into, in some sense, what kind of person do you want to be as you engage with all of these different things that are happening? And so it really comes down to things like, I want to be a confident person, right? Or I want to be a person who is at peace, or I want to be a person who finds satisfaction within myself, right? And so I think that's a really important distinction, is like, we're not saying, what do you hope changes about the world? But we're saying, what do you hope about yourself that will help you to engage with the world in a meaningful, purposeful way?
Yeah, that I'm realizing as we dig that we'll probably talk about this for hours. And so I'll try my best to stay, right where we want to be in this conversation. But just as you're, discussing, there are so many inherent assumptions in being able to ask that question. What are your best hopes despite all these things that you're dealing with, despite everything that's going on? And as you hinted at, there's obviously this assumption of there are things you can be hopeful for, and there's something at the top of that would really make a difference. I think also inherent to what you're just describing is there's a version of you that could actually, exist in this environment, in this context, that you would be pretty satisfied with, that would actually see itself, doing quite well. There's so many assumptions, I think, like that. And those assumptions, I think, are what kind of makes that question difficult, especially if the circumstances are really, really tough circumstances. But I think they also power how helpful that is. I think it's tempting for clinicians, for clients, for anyone who might be introduced to that kind of a question, to see it as, before we get anywhere, before we do the work of this session, just tell me what you're hopeful for. This is some type of precursor to us doing the real work. I think actually a lot of work happens when someone digs down and tries to answer that question of, what do I want for myself? What am I hoping for? What's the version of me that I would see actually handling this situation in a really satisfying way?
Yeah, I think the other thing that is important about this step, right, is that it's not something that just comes easily, right? Even answering this, what is your best hopes question, it will require some work, some level of introspection to say, what kind of person do I want to be? And that will, I think, entail thinking about, what are my personal values? What are the parts of me that I find the most important or the most vital? What, in some sense, if I could be a person that I'm proud of and that other people would be proud of, how would I describe that person? So it'll take some personal reflection, introspection work even to determine, what kind of person do I want to be? And only until you understand that, like you said, the version of you that you're hoping for, that you're aiming for, can you then move on to other parts of this that will help you to navigate this turmoil that exists.
And I think one of the many, I absolutely agree with all of that. And so far, we've done a great job of just describing this as hard. But I hope that the point comes across that it's hard is the negligible part. It's extremely useful. It's extremely constructive.
And doable, I think.
Very doable, extremely doable. We probably do it sometimes without even realizing that this is, some constructive process that's happening. But what I was going to say is that I think one of the many huge prizes of doing that is that it unlocks all of the ripple effects of what that version of you would be able to accomplish, or what happens as a result of that version of you becoming more present. And even if that's only in your description of what would happen, not to say that it's only useful if it actually happens, because then you can begin to imagine, well, what would I do in that kind of circumstance? How would other people interact with me? How would the context that I'm in look a little bit different to me if I were that version of myself? And all of this just happening within your head or within a conversation, I think that's very easy to see how helpful that can be, how much that changes for you if you're able to engage in something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important. So I think the first step, obviously, is to really be thoughtful and to say, what version of myself do I want to be as I engage with this level of turmoil and difficulty? And I think the second tip that we would have for people to deal with turmoil is to, in some sense, I'm going to put it together as co-construction, and I hope you'll help me unpack that a bit. But I think in some sense, we have the ability to construct how we view the world. We all are experiencing all of these things that we mentioned, right? And some people look at these things as opportunities, right? Some people will think, oh, I've always had this business idea, or I've had this product that I've been wanting to make. This is the prime time because now people need this thing, right? And so some people will see turmoil or the transition of power, and they'll see an opportunity. Other people may look at it and react with fear. This is something that I need to be afraid of. So instead of engaging with the world, I need to turn off the news. I need to sequester myself within my own little bubble, or only surround myself with people who think like I think, or who hope like I hope. And so we experience the same events, but the way that we view those events impacts not just our perception, but also our behavior. And so I think that's one thing, kind of a precursor, is we have the ability to construct how we view something, how we choose to engage with that. And I think one of the easiest ways to construct that is to think back to, okay, so what version of myself do I want to show up? And then go through at least the thought exercise. And I would say at least, because you could probably go much further than just the thought exercise, but say, so if the courageous version of me, what would the courageous version of me see when I read this story? Or if the peaceful version of me showed up, how would that peaceful version of me take in this new information? And so it's really putting to work, this is the kind of person that I want to be. And then very deliberately saying, okay, now that I have new, potentially scary information or anxiety-provoking information, if the version of me that I want to be shows up, what would be different about the way that I engage with this information?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's nearly impossible to overestimate how powerful that is. This first, the ability that we have to construct meaning and what we can do with that, and then the ability to modify how we're constructing meaning and the meaning that we're making with things. And thinking through this in the way that you're saying, that's just so exciting to me, to think about how that gives us access to modify the constructions that we have and the meanings that we're having, to be able to say, well, let me think about the courageous version of myself and how that version of me is consuming the things around me, or interacting with the world around me, or thinking about things that I need to think about. Like we were saying in the beginning, it felt like we're building this, there's this uphill battle that we're doing, but actually what you're doing is you're diving into this process that actually gives you a lot of capability, a lot of power. And I think, at the heart of why we're talking about this today is there is certainty to be found in that, right? Like now you can actually find some reliable source, a sense of security, or a sense of, I have agency in this turmoil that we're living in.
Yeah. And I think as you were talking, it reminded me of kind of a micro example of this. Earlier today, actually, my youngest daughter is preparing to go to middle school, right? So she's transitioning from one school that she knows, that she's familiar with, to a new school that she does not know, right? And this is a very anxiety-provoking experience, right? I don't know who will be in my classes. I don't even know who my teacher is going to be. I don't know what the schedule is going to look like. I've never had to move from one class to another class. What if lunch is too early or too late, right? So there's all of these things. What am I going to do now that there's no recess? And so there's lots of reasons to be anxious or worried or unfamiliar or whatever. Well, earlier today, her new teacher, her homeroom teacher, called us to say, I am going to be her teacher. And this is a teacher this is my youngest child. So we've been through this school with 2 other children before. And this is a teacher, the only teacher that both of our previous children have had. So this is a teacher that we now, for the 3rd time, the only teacher who we have had all 3 of our children experience. So as soon as she called, then for us as parents, it was kind of like this sense of relief of like, okay, this is a person that we know, this is a person that we like. And the teacher on the other side of the phone was also saying, when I saw her name on my list, there was a sense of relief because I kind of know what to expect because I've seen 2 others before. And so after that call, then we went and talked to our youngest child and we said, your teacher just called. And before we even told her who it was, she said, is it Miss Wallace? And thankfully it was Miss Wallace. And we were like, yes, it's Miss Wallace. And then the experience, like you could physically see worry and anxiety and tension just kind of melt away because there was this sense of familiarity. And it was, even though I don't know her, I know my siblings know her and have talked about her and they like her and all these things. And so that one piece of information was enough to like watch worry and anxiety melt away. And I think sometimes when we hang our hope on something like that, right? If we say, if I got to encounter Miss Wallace, what kind of person would I be? What kind of student would I want to be? How would I engage with her? If something, and we could easily walk through that thought exercise and say, okay, so on the first day when you're probably going to be nervous, how would Miss Wallace know that you're going to trust her or that you can engage with her in a way that she's going to be happy that you're sitting in her class, right? And so just having one piece of information can be enough to start constructing reasons why I don't need to be afraid, reasons why I don't need to be worried, reasons why I don't need to panic. And so sometimes I think that's in our construction of reality. If we can find things that are reasons to be hopeful, and if we can find nuggets that are true for us, we can then start to construct, now that I know that one piece, how do I want to engage with the rest of uncertainty, but knowing this one piece of reality?
I think that's a beautiful example. And I think it also even depicts from an outside perspective, my outside perspective, knowing your daughter, Julia, how a totally different version of her will show up with her being more comfortable. Because I heard her wonder out loud many times about dropping out of school just because of how kind of nervous she was for going into middle school.
That is a reality that we deal with.
But that reminds me actually, since we're talking about like political, geopolitical, huge things, just heard, I think it was on a podcast or something. She was gender rights specialist as well as like an anthropologist, and she studied gender equality around the world throughout history very thoroughly too. I don't know how she's looked into very specific examples all around the world. And she was saying how there's actually different forms of oppression of women's rights in different areas, under different political systems, under different leaders. You would think that either you have the rights or you don't have the rights. But in some places, they not only don't have the rights, they don't even have the opportunity to imagine that those rights are possible for themselves. And so she was saying in one country where, women are so oppressed and so secluded that they're not allowed to really leave the home or be away from, some male authority figure. And so there's no gathering of women. There's no women in public spaces. There's no women thinking out loud. There's no women on TV. And that obviously really constricts the imagination for what could be possible for women. But in countries where there's still terrible gender inequality, women don't have the rights. They aren't allowed to do a lot of things, but they're at least allowed to be in public. They're allowed to speak with each other and think out loud. There might be organizations of women who come together and talk about their thoughts and share their different realities and their families and different things like that. And they're able to say, I've heard about this happening over here. This other woman in her home, she got her husband to do the dishes. I've also heard about a woman in the town over who started to say, it would be nice if we could vote, if we could have our voice in the political system. And then that starts to turn into activism and organizing and larger gatherings of women actually starting to win their rights. And the only difference that they have is the ability to really cling to the hope of there's something better than what we have right now. And that makes a difference. She said in those situations, it's almost inevitable that they will get their rights. They'll get to a place where they're not living the same reality as their mother or their grandmother.
Yeah, and I think that's such a beautiful example. And I think what the other thing I really like about that example is the ability to gather, right? It's not that we all immediately agree or that we see things the same way, but it's just that we can come together and, connected to this idea that we're talking about, construct something, right? One person can throw out the idea of, wouldn't it be amazing if we could vote? And I imagine in those gatherings, another person would say, that's never going to happen. Like, that's not possible for us. Or if one person says, I got my husband to wash the dishes, I'm sure there are other people who would say, like, I can never imagine my husband doing that, right? So it's not that they had complete agreement or that they saw things the same way or whatever, but it's that they can construct a reality where possibilities could occur.
That's exactly it.
Right. And I think that that's such a beautiful thing that really encapsulates these two concepts that we've talked about, right? That hope is present and that you can construct something based on that hope. It may not bring about immediate change in the world around you, but it does change how you view things. It does change what you think is possible. It does change then subsequent behavior where you advocate for that, or maybe you talk to your husband in a different way, or whatever those small changes are. But it brings about a sense of control in an environment that can oftentimes be outside of your control.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that encapsulates what we're aiming for in having this conversation in the first place. What else, I guess, is a part of this process? You have the hope, you know what you're looking for, and then you start to access the ability to construct new meaning and new ways of looking at things that might give you a bit more agency and security. What else?
I think the last thing that's really important in this context is that I would say I'll just put it under the umbrella of noticing. And I think we tend to see what we're paying attention to, right? As soon as, oftentimes, an example is, I start looking for a new car. And let's say I decide I want a Toyota. So then all of a sudden, because I'm searching online for Toyotas, or I start asking people who own Toyotas, do you like your car? As soon as I start to put my focus on that, then as I drive around town, I start to notice all of the Toyotas. And I start thinking to myself, man, I've never known so many people drove a Toyota before, right? And I think that concept of noticing is really consistent with how we manage during times of difficulty. When we outline really clearly, this is the version of the person I want to be, when we start to construct what differences that will mean for us, then we start to notice that some of those things are already playing out in our lives. We start to notice when other people exhibit those personality traits or those characteristics that are consistent with what I'm hoping for. And then if I go up to that person and I say, I've noticed that you act like this, or you do this, or you believe like this. How did you get to be like that? All of a sudden, it builds momentum. And I think oftentimes what keeps us stifled is that our focus is on the fact that we are stifled. And as soon as we kind of orient our attention to what is potentially possible, then we start to notice that there are indicators that could actually come about. And it creates this forward momentum that can push us toward that. And so I think that's the third concept I think that I would say is that we just need to start noticing what's consistent with what we're hoping for.
Yeah, I really like the idea of noticing as solidifying this thing we've started with these other steps in this process. It's almost as if those first two steps pose a bit of a question about what's possible, right? Like, can I really be a courageous person? Can I really be a little bit more comfortable or satisfied with the situation that I'm in? Is this really possible? And then when you begin the step of noticing, that's a bit of the answer, right? That's you start to say, it looks like it is possible. This thing showed up. I saw this thing happen. I saw myself do this thing. I felt this kind of a way. I caught how this really might be able to piece itself together and be a reality.
Yeah. So I think as we think about that in the context kind of, again, of this like world upheaval, this complete chaos that's happening around us. I think those three concepts can really, really help people to not get overwhelmed by the magnitude of what's happening. When we think about what version of myself do I want to be when I engage with this, when I construct that in great detail and I ask myself, what would my children notice about me? What would my partner notice about me? What would my friends notice about me? When we start to construct that then all points to signs that can just verify that, like you mentioned, that this is a possible reality that I can have. And again, it may not change the world, but it can change my world. Certainly. I think that's where people function the best, is where they feel like they have a sense of their own world, they have a sense of control within their own world, and that there's something hopeful to be moving toward within the sphere of their own influence.
Yeah. The beautiful thing about that is I think it applies to everything, right? Of course, you can use that for maybe very quiet hopes and ambitions that you have for yourself. You want a certain job, you want a certain relationship, whatever. But even the huge, very encompassing things like we've been discussing here, the global stability of the world, the economic future of the world, future of climate and what that means for the environment and society. You can find that sense of agency, comfort, security, possibility of new realities, all of that in any of these things.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thanks for engaging in this conversation. I appreciate it.
Always. This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution-focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution-focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution-focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution-focused brief therapy.